The year is roughly 410 CE, and a profound silence begins to fall across the Roman province of Britannia. A silence born not of peace, but of absence. For nearly 4 centuries, the rhythmic clang of legionary boots, the ordered murmur of Latin in administrative halls, and the distant trumpets signalling changing guards had been the heartbeat of this distant outpost of empire. But now, those sounds were fading, replaced by the whisper of the wind through abandoned villas and the growing unease in the hearts of those left behind. The legions, stretched thin across a crumbling empire, had been recalled to defend Rome itself, leaving Britannia to fend for itself against a rising tide of external threats and internal strife. Imagine, if you will, the last Roman governor, perhaps a man named Victorinus, or even a shadowy figure whose name is lost to time, standing on a wind-swayed hill, looking back at the distant glimmer of a lighthouse on the coast, knowing that the ships carrying his soldiers and their families were sailing away, perhaps forever. The meticulously built roads, the sprawling baths, the vibrant market towns, all that infrastructure of order and civilization, now stood vulnerable, like a magnificent but empty stage after the players have departed. The Romano-British population, accustomed to the protective shield of Rome, found themselves adrift in a sea of uncertainty. They were, in essence, an island cast loose from its moorings. This wasn't an abrupt, single event, but a slow, agonizing withdrawal, a gradual unraveling of imperial control that spanned decades. The official date often cited, 410 CE, marks the moment when Emperor Honorius famously told the Britons to look to their own defences. But the reality was far messier. A series of desperate pleas for help from Britannia to Rome, met with increasingly hollow promises and eventually silence. The province, once a jewel in Rome's crown, had become a burden the ailing empire could no longer afford. With the Roman military gone, the existing social and political structures began to fray. The centralized administration dissolved, and local leaders, often former Roman officials or tribal chieftains, stepped into the void, attempting to maintain order in a fractured landscape. But their authority was often localized and tenuous. The intricate trade networks that had flourished under Roman peace dwindled, and the sophisticated urban centers, once bustling hubs of commerce and culture, began to decline. Many Romano-British citizens, accustomed to a life within fortified walls, found themselves increasingly vulnerable to raids from Picts and Scots from the north, and, more ominously, from seafaring raiders from across the North Sea. These raiders were the Anglo-Saxons, a collective term for various Germanic tribes, primarily Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, originating from what is now modern-day Germany and Denmark. Their longships, with their distinctive square sails and dragon-prowed bows, had likely been probing the British coast for decades, even centuries, prior to the Roman departure. But with the Roman legions gone, their sporadic raids transformed into something far more ambitious: settlement. Picture the scene. A small coastal village, perhaps a collection of thatched huts near a river mouth, suddenly confronted by the sight of these longships emerging from the morning mist. The Anglo-Saxons were fierce warriors, but they were also farmers and settlers, driven by a desire for fertile land and new opportunities. They didn't arrive as a single, unified invasion force, but rather as a series of migrations and incursions, sometimes invited as mercenaries by desperate Romano-British leaders, sometimes simply landing and taking what they wanted. One of the most enduring stories, though likely embellished over centuries, tells of Vortigern, a powerful Romano-British leader, who in the mid-5th century supposedly invited two Jutish chieftains, Hengist and Horsa, to help him fight off the Picts and Scots. The story goes that these mercenaries, once established, saw the rich lands of Britannia and decided to stay, eventually turning on their hosts. While the specifics of this tale are debated by historians, some view it as a foundational myth rather than strict historical fact. It captures the essence of the complex and often violent interactions that characterized this period. The arrival of the Anglo-Saxons was not a swift conquest, but a gradual process of displacement, assimilation, and cultural transformation that unfolded over several centuries. The Romano-British, often referred to as the Welsh by the Anglo-Saxons, a term meaning foreigners, resisted fiercely. Legendary figures like King Arthur, whether historical or mythical, emerge from this era, embodying the hopes and struggles of the native Britons fighting to preserve their way of life against the encroaching Germanic tide. The historical evidence for Arthur is scant, a few fleeting mentions in early Welsh poetry and chronicles, but his enduring presence in folklore speaks to the profound impact of this period of conflict and cultural clash. Historians still debate whether Arthur was a single historical figure, a composite of several war leaders, or entirely a product of myth-making, but his legend undeniably reflects the spirit of resistance. As the Anglo-Saxons pushed westward, the Britons were gradually pushed into the western fringes of the island, Cornwall, Wales, and parts of what is now Scotland. The linguistic landscape of Britain began to shift dramatically. Latin and the various Brittonic Celtic languages, once dominant, slowly gave way to Old English, the language of the Anglo-Saxons. Place names across much of England still bear witness to this transformation. Towns ending in ton, farmstead, ham, village, burg, fortified place, and ing, people of, are ubiquitous, replacing the older Celtic and Roman nomenclature. The Anglo-Saxons brought with them their own social structures, their own pagan gods, and their own distinct artistic traditions. Their society was tribal, organized around powerful warrior chiefs and their retinues. Over time, these smaller tribal units began to coalesce into larger kingdoms. By the 7th and 8th centuries, a patchwork of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had emerged across what we now call England. These were often referred to as the Heptarchy, though the number of dominant kingdoms fluctuated. The most prominent among them included Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex. Each of these kingdoms had its own distinct character, its own royal lineage, and its own ambitions. They were frequently at war with one another, vying for supremacy and control over resources and territory. The concept of a unified England was still centuries away. Instead, it was a land of competing powers, where alliances shifted like the tides. The landscape itself reflected this nascent political geography. Vast forests separated kingdoms, rivers served as natural boundaries, and fortified burhs, towns, dotted the land, offering protection and serving as centres of local power. Life in these early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was largely agrarian. The vast majority of the population lived in small villages, working the land, raising livestock, and producing what they needed to survive. Settlements were often clustered around a hall, the residence of the local lord or king, which served as a focal point for communal life, feasting, and justice. The rhythm of life was dictated by the seasons, by the planting and harvesting of crops, and by the ever-present threat of famine or disease. The Anglo-Saxons were also skilled artisans. Their metalwork, particularly their intricate jewelry and weaponry, reveals a sophisticated aesthetic and mastery of technique. The Sutton Hoo ship burial, discovered in Suffolk in 1939, offers an astonishing glimpse into the wealth and artistic prowess of an early Anglo-Saxon king, likely Raedwald of East Anglia, who died around 625 CE. The sheer opulence of the grave goods, golden buckles, intricate garnet inlaid shoulder clasps, a magnificent helmet, and a ceremonial shield speaks volumes about the hierarchical nature of their society and the importance of martial prowess and display. It also hints at the extensive trade networks that still existed, as some of the materials and designs show influences from across Europe. One fascinating, yet often overlooked, aspect of this period is the gradual reintroduction of Christianity to England. While the Roman withdrawal had largely severed the ties between the British Isles and the Christian Roman Empire, pockets of Christianity survived, particularly in the western British kingdoms. However, the Anglo-Saxons were pagan, worshipping a pantheon of gods similar to the Norse deities. Figures like Woden, Odin, Thunor, Thor, and Tyr, whose names still echo in our days of the week: Wednesday, Thursday, Tuesday. The major push for conversion came from two directions. From the south, in 597 CE, Pope Gregory the Great sent a mission, led by Augustine, to Kent, the kingdom of Ethelbert, whose wife Bertha was a Christian Frankish princess. Augustine established his see at Canterbury, which remains the spiritual heart of the Church of England to this day. From the north, Irish monks, inspired by figures like St. Patrick and St. Columba, spread a distinct form of Celtic Christianity into Northumbria and other northern kingdoms, establishing monasteries like Lindisfarne, which became centres of learning and artistic production, famed for illuminated manuscripts like the Lindisfarne Gospels. The meeting of these two Christian traditions, the Roman and the Celtic, led to a period of theological debate and eventual synthesis. The Synod of Whitby in 664 CE is a pivotal moment. King Oswiu of Northumbria ultimately decided to adopt the Roman customs, primarily concerning the calculation of Easter and the style of monastic tonsure. This decision gradually brought the Anglo-Saxon Church into closer alignment with the broader European Christian world, fostering cultural and intellectual exchange. The conversion to Christianity brought with it literacy and a new administrative structure. Monasteries became vital centres of learning, preserving knowledge, copying manuscripts, and educating future generations of clergy and administrators. They also served as economic hubs, often owning vast tracts of land and employing many people. The introduction of written law codes, often influenced by Christian principles, began to lay the groundwork for a more formalized legal system. This period, often called the Dark Ages by earlier historians, is increasingly recognized as a vibrant and transformative era. While it saw the decline of Roman urbanism, it also witnessed the birth of a new culture, a new language, and new political entities that would eventually coalesce into England. The Anglo-Saxons were not merely destructive invaders, they were creators of a complex and enduring society, laying the foundations for much of what we recognize as English today. Their poetry, like the epic Beowulf, speaks of a world of heroes and monsters, of loyalty and fate, offering a window into their values and worldview. The land itself, once crisscrossed by Roman roads and dotted with villas, was slowly being reshaped. Forests were cleared for farmland, new villages sprang up, and the old Roman towns, if not entirely abandoned, were often reoccupied and repurposed. Their grand stone buildings slowly crumbling, their materials sometimes scavenged for new constructions. The very landscape began to tell a new story, written in the fields and fells, the names of rivers and hamlets, a story of Anglo-Saxon ascendancy. If you're enjoying this, make sure to subscribe and leave in the comments the time and place you're listening from. The tapestry of Britain, woven with Roman threads, now began to fray and restitch itself into a patchwork of smaller, fiercely independent kingdoms. The departure of the legions had left a vacuum, and into this space flowed the Anglo-Saxons, Angles, Saxons, and Jutes from across the North Sea. They were not a unified invading force, but rather a series of migrating peoples, settling, conquering, and establishing their own domains. This period, often called the Heptarchy, was a complex dance of power among 7, sometimes more, principal kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex. Imagine a landscape where each river valley, each stretch of fertile land could be claimed by a different chieftain, their banners fluttering in the wind, their warriors ever watchful. For nearly 4 centuries, from the 5th to the 9th, these kingdoms vied for dominance. The concept of a single England was still a distant dream, a whisper on the wind. Instead, there was a constant shifting struggle for Bretwaldership, a term that meant written ruler or wide ruler, signifying a king who held a certain overlordship, a prestige that transcended his own kingdom's borders. This wasn't a formal empire, but rather a recognition of superior military and political power, often enforced through tribute and alliances. One king might rise to prominence, his influence spreading like ripples across a pond, only for another to challenge him, to seize the mantle of Bretwalder. Northumbria in the north was one of the first to achieve this fleeting supremacy. Under powerful kings like Edwin in the early 7th century, it became a vibrant centre of learning and Christian culture. Monasteries like Lindisfarne and Wearmouth Jarrow flourished, producing illuminated manuscripts, and scholars like Bede, whose Ecclesiastical History of the English People, completed around 731 AD, remains an invaluable window into this era. Picture the monks, hunched over vellum, their quills scratching softly in the flickering lamplight, preserving knowledge while outside, kingdoms clashed. Edwin's conversion to Christianity, a pivotal moment, was said to have been influenced by his Christian wife, Ethelba, and the missionary Paulinus. Legend holds that after much deliberation, Edwin's chief priest, Coifi, dramatically cast down his idols, declaring the old gods powerless. This wasn't just a spiritual shift. It often brought kingdoms into the wider European Christian network, opening new avenues for trade, diplomacy, and the written word. But Northumbria's glory was not to last. Its power waned, giving way to the ascendancy of Mercia, a kingdom situated in the heart of what we now call England. Mercia's rise was particularly pronounced under King Offa, who reigned from 757 to 796 AD. Offa was perhaps the most powerful of the Bretwalders, his influence extending far beyond Mercian borders. He was a shrewd politician, and a formidable warrior, known for his diplomatic relations with Charlemagne, the Frankish emperor. Imagine two titans of their age, corresponding across the Channel, discussing trade, church matters, and even the marriage of their children. Offa even issued his own coinage, notably the Offa's Dyke penny, a testament to his economic and political sophistication. His most enduring legacy, however, is the monumental earthwork known as Offa's Dyke, a vast defensive barrier stretching for over 150 miles along the border with Wales. Historians still debate its exact purpose. Was it a military fortification, a customs barrier, or merely a grand statement of power? Perhaps it was all three, a testament to Mercia's ambition and a physical manifestation of its claim to dominance. This massive undertaking, built without modern machinery, speaks volumes about the organized labor and authority Offa commanded. The Heptarchy was a dynamic system, constantly in flux. Alliances were made and broken. Kings rose and fell, and the map of Anglo-Saxon England was redrawn countless times. The smaller kingdoms, like Kent and Essex, often found themselves caught between the ambitions of their larger neighbours, forced to pay tribute or offer military support. It was a time of shifting loyalties and pragmatic decisions, where survival often depended on choosing the right side, or at least not making too many powerful enemies. Yet, even as these Anglo-Saxon kingdoms consolidated their power and began to develop distinct cultural identities, a new and terrifying threat was emerging from across the sea. The Vikings. Their longships, swift and deadly, first appeared on the horizons of Britain in the late 8th century. The initial raids were sporadic, hit-and-run attacks on coastal monasteries and settlements, seeking plunder and slaves. The infamous raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD sent shockwaves across Christian Europe. Imagine the shock and terror as these foreign warriors, speaking an unknown tongue, descended upon a peaceful monastic community, slaughtering monks and desecrating holy relics. This was not just an attack. It was a profound cultural and religious trauma. These early raids were a prelude to something far more sustained and destructive. By the mid-9th century, the Vikings were no longer merely raiders. They were invaders, arriving in larger numbers, with intentions of settlement and conquest. The Great Heathen Army, as it was known, landed in East Anglia in 865 AD, marking a turning point. This was a coordinated military force, not just a band of pirates. They systematically began to conquer the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms one by one. East Anglia fell, then Northumbria, and Mercia was severely weakened. The sound of their war horns, the clash of their axes, and the sight of their dragon-headed longships became a terrifying reality for the Anglo-Saxon peoples. It was against this backdrop of widespread devastation and impending doom that the Kingdom of Wessex in the southwest began to emerge as the last bastion of Anglo-Saxon resistance. Wessex had, for a time, been overshadowed by Mercia, but it possessed a strong royal lineage and a growing military capability. Its kings, like Egbert, had already asserted their dominance over some of the smaller southern kingdoms. But it was under the leadership of Alfred, who ascended to the throne in 871 AD, that Wessex would truly rise to meet the existential threat posed by the Vikings. Alfred's early reign was marked by constant warfare and near defeat. The Vikings, led by formidable figures like Guthrum, pressed relentlessly. In 878 AD, Alfred suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Chippenham, forcing him to flee into the marshes of Athelney in Somerset. This was a moment of profound crisis, a time when the very survival of Anglo-Saxon England hung by a thread. Legend has it that while in hiding, Alfred, disguised as a peasant, was rebuked by a peasant woman for burning her cakes while lost in thought. A charming, if apocryphal, tale that humanizes the king in his darkest hour. This period of retreat, however, was not one of despair, but of strategic planning and regrouping. From his marshland refuge, Alfred rallied his forces. He understood that to defeat the Vikings, he needed more than just a standing army. He needed a more organized defense. He began to implement a system of fortified burhs, strategically placed towns and strongholds that could serve as defensive garrisons and centers of trade. These burhs were not just castles. They were planned settlements, often with grids of streets and walls, designed to protect the population and provide a safe haven. This network of burhs, a lesser-known but crucial detail, transformed the defensive landscape of Wessex, allowing for a more effective response to Viking incursions. Imagine these early urban centers, bustling with activity, their walls offering a sense of security in a turbulent world. Alfred's efforts culminated in the decisive Battle of Edington in 878 AD, where his revitalized army inflicted a major defeat on Guthrum's forces. This was a pivotal victory, not just for Wessex, but for the future of England. Following the battle, Alfred negotiated the Treaty of Wetmore, an agreement that saw Guthrum convert to Christianity and establish the Danelaw, a region in the east and north of England where Viking law and customs prevailed. This treaty, while ceding significant territory to the Vikings, effectively halted their westward expansion and secured the independence of Wessex. It was a pragmatic solution, acknowledging the reality of Viking settlement while preserving a core Anglo-Saxon kingdom. Alfred was not just a warrior king, he was a visionary. He understood that military might alone was not enough to rebuild a shattered society. He initiated a program of cultural and educational revival, recognizing that the Viking invasions had severely damaged learning and literacy. He famously lamented the decline of Latin scholarship and promoted the use of the vernacular, Old English, to translate important religious and historical texts. He even learned Latin himself in adulthood, a testament to his dedication. Imagine the king in the midst of rebuilding his kingdom, taking time to study, to translate, to ensure that knowledge would not be lost. He brought scholars from the continent and established schools, laying the groundwork for a more educated clergy and administration. This intellectual flourishing, often overlooked in favor of his military achievements, was crucial for the long-term stability and identity of England. Alfred's reign also saw the beginnings of a more unified English identity. By successfully resisting the Vikings and establishing a stable, well-governed kingdom, he became a symbol of Anglo-Saxon resilience. He began to be referred to as King of the Anglo-Saxons, a title that hinted at a broader vision than just the King of Wessex. He died in 899 AD, leaving behind a kingdom that was not only secure, but also poised for future growth and unification. His legacy was profound. He had not only saved Wessex, but had laid the foundations for a unified English kingdom. The work of unification, however, was not completed by Alfred alone. His children and grandchildren continued his efforts. His son, Edward the Elder, and his daughter, Ethelflad, Lady of the Mercians, were formidable leaders in their own right. Ethelflad, in particular, was a remarkable figure, leading armies and building burhs, expanding Anglo-Saxon control over Mercia and pushing back against the remaining Viking strongholds. She was a military strategist and a ruler of considerable skill, a rare example of a powerful female leader in early medieval Europe. Imagine her, a woman of royal blood, commanding respect and loyalty from her warriors, leading them into battle against the Vikings. By the mid-10th century, under kings like Aethelstan, Alfred's grandson, the process of unification was largely complete. Aethelstan, crowned in 925 AD, is often considered the first true king of England. He expanded his authority further, defeating a coalition of Scots, Welsh and Vikings at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937 AD, a victory celebrated in Old English poetry. This battle was a momentous clash, solidifying the nascent English kingdom's dominance over its neighbours. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a contemporary historical record, extols Aethelstan's reign as a golden age, a time of peace and prosperity. The patchwork of the Heptarchy had finally been stitched together, not without struggle and bloodshed, but into a recognisable, if still evolving, Kingdom of England. The dream of a unified realm, once a distant whisper, had become a tangible reality, forged in the crucible of Viking invasions and the resolute leadership of the House of Wessex. The whispers of the wind carried new sounds across the North Sea, harsher and more guttural than the gentle murmur of Anglo-Saxon tongues. These were the voices of the Northmen, the Vikings whose longships, sleek and terrifying, began to cut through the misty dawns of England in the late 8th century. Their arrival was not a gentle dawn, but a sudden, brutal awakening, an end to the relative peace that had settled over the island after the initial Anglo-Saxon migrations. The first recorded raid, a chilling harbinger of what was to come, struck the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793 AD. This holy island, a beacon of learning and spirituality, was plundered, its monks slaughtered or enslaved, its sacred treasures carried off. The shock reverberated through Christendom. How could God allow such sacrilege? It was a question that would haunt the English for generations. These were not mere pirates seeking quick plunder. They were explorers, traders, and ultimately settlers, driven by a complex mix of factors: land hunger, political instability in their homelands, and perhaps the sheer thrill of discovery and conquest. From their Scandinavian strongholds, they launched expeditions that would forever alter the map of Europe. For England, the initial raids were hit-and-run affairs, targeting wealthy coastal monasteries and undefended settlements. The Vikings, with their superior shipbuilding and navigation skills, could strike swiftly and disappear before any organized resistance could be mounted. Their dragon-prowed ships, shallow-drafted and capable of navigating both open seas and rivers, allowed them to penetrate deep into the heart of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. As the 9th century progressed, the raids grew in scale and ambition. What began as seasonal plunder soon evolved into a more permanent presence. In 865 AD, a formidable force, later dubbed the Great Heathen Army by Anglo-Saxon chroniclers, landed in East Anglia. This was no raiding party. It was an army of conquest, led by figures whose names would echo through history: Halfdan Ragnarsson, Ivar the Boneless, and Ubba. Their aim was not just loot, but land. They systematically dismantled the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms one by one. Northumbria fell, its capital York, Jorvik to the Vikings, becoming a thriving Norse city. East Anglia followed, its king, Edmund, martyred for refusing to renounce his Christian faith. Mercia, the largest and most powerful of the remaining kingdoms, was severely weakened and eventually divided. Only the Kingdom of Wessex, under the leadership of its extraordinary king, Alfred, stood against the tide. Alfred, who ascended to the throne in 871 AD, inherited a kingdom on the brink of collapse. His early years were marked by desperate struggles, including a period where he was forced to retreat into the marshes of Athelney, a king in hiding, seemingly defeated. It was during this time, according to legend, that the famous incident of the burning cakes occurred, a tale that humanizes a monarch, often seen as an almost mythical figure. Whether true or not, it speaks to the dire straits in which Alfred found himself. Yet, from these depths, Alfred rallied. He understood that to defeat the Vikings, he needed to adapt. He reformed his army, creating a system of rotating levies and fortified burhs, towns, that could provide defense and refuge. He also began building a navy, recognizing the importance of challenging the Vikings at sea. The turning point came in 878 AD at the Battle of Edington. Alfred's forces, emerging from the marshes, decisively defeated the great heathen army led by Guthrum. This victory was not merely a military triumph, it was a psychological one, proving that the Vikings were not invincible. The subsequent Treaty of Wedmore, signed shortly after Edington, formalized a new reality for England. It established a boundary, roughly following Watling Street, that divided the island. To the south and west lay Alfred's Wessex, the last independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom. To the north and east lay the Danelaw, a vast territory under Danish control, where Norse law and customs prevailed. The Danelaw was not a monolithic entity, but a patchwork of Danish-controlled areas, each with its own jarls or kings. Yet a distinct cultural identity began to emerge within its borders. Place names across eastern England still bear witness to this Norse influence, with suffixes like by, village, and thorp, hamlet, being common. Legal customs, agricultural practices, and even aspects of language were profoundly shaped by the Scandinavian settlers. Historians still debate the extent of the cultural assimilation that occurred within the Danelaw. Was it a complete Norse takeover, or did the Anglo-Saxon population largely continue their way of life under new rulers, with a gradual blending of traditions? Archaeological evidence suggests a complex interplay, with both conflict and cooperation, and a significant degree of cultural exchange. The discovery of Viking hordes alongside Anglo-Saxon artifacts points to both the wealth generated and the anxieties of the time. Alfred, meanwhile, was not content with merely holding his own. He embarked on a program of cultural and intellectual revival, recognizing that a strong kingdom needed more than just military might. He promoted education, commissioning translations of Latin works into Old English, including Bede's Ecclesiastical History and Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy. He invited scholars to his court and initiated the compilation of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a vital historical record that chronicles the events of his reign and those that followed. These efforts earned him the epithet Alfred the Great, a title rarely bestowed upon English monarchs. His legacy was not just military defense, but the preservation and strengthening of English identity in the face of existential threat. After Alfred's death in 899 AD, his successors, particularly his son Edward the Elder and his grandson Athelstan, continued the slow, arduous process of reconquest. This period, often called the Reconquest of the Danelaw, was a testament to the strategic vision laid down by Alfred. Edward and Athelstan systematically pushed back the Danish frontiers, capturing burh after burh, integrating the conquered territories back into the expanding English kingdom. Athelstan, in particular, achieved a level of dominance that had not been seen since the days of Mercian supremacy. In 927 AD, he conquered York, the last independent Viking kingdom, effectively unifying England under a single monarch. He was recognized by his contemporaries and by later historians as the first true King of England, ruling over a realm that encompassed both Anglo-Saxon and former Danish territories. His victory at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937 AD, a monumental clash against a coalition of Scots, Strathclyde Buttons, and Vikings, cemented his claim and is celebrated in one of the most vivid poems in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. However, the peace was fragile. The lure of England's wealth remained strong, and new waves of Viking incursions began in the late 10th century, often attributed to the resurgence of powerful Scandinavian kings. This second wave of Viking attacks was different from the first. These were often organized by powerful kings, notably Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark, and later his son, Canute. The English kings, particularly Ethelred the Unready, struggled to respond effectively. Ethelred's reign is largely characterized by a policy of Danegeld, the payment of tribute to the Vikings in exchange for peace. While this might have offered temporary respite, it ultimately proved to be a self-defeating strategy, merely encouraging further demands and demonstrating English weakness. The sums paid were enormous, draining the kingdom's resources and demoralizing its people. The situation reached its nadir in the early 11th century. Sweyn Forkbeard, after years of raiding, gang and demanding tribute, launched a full-scale invasion in 1013 AD, driving Ethelred into exile and briefly becoming King of England. Upon Sweyn's sudden death, Ethelred returned, but the struggle continued with Sweyn's son, Canute. Canute, a formidable warrior and shrewd politician, eventually secured the English throne in 1016 AD, after a protracted struggle with Ethelred's son, Edmund Ironside. Canute's reign marked a surprising turn in English history. Instead of merely plundering, he sought to rule justly and effectively. He united England with Denmark and Norway, creating a vast North Sea empire that stretched from Scandinavia to the British Isles. Canute, despite being a conqueror, presented himself as a Christian king, respecting English law and customs. He made pilgrimages to Rome, promoted the church, and even issued his own law codes. His reign, from 1016 to 1035 AD, is often remembered as a period of stability and prosperity for England, a stark contrast to the chaos that preceded it. He integrated Danish and English elites, demonstrating a remarkable ability to govern diverse peoples. This era, where a Viking king ruled England, is a fascinating example of how conquest could lead not just to destruction, but to new forms of political and cultural synthesis. The story of Canute ordering the tides to retreat, a tale meant to illustrate the limits of even a king's power, also speaks to his ambition and the respect he commanded. However, Canute's empire proved to be personal rather than institutional. After his death, his sons struggled to maintain control, and the North Sea Empire fractured. By 1042 AD, the English throne returned to the Anglo-Saxon line with the accession of Edward the Confessor, son of Ethelred the Unready. Edward, who had spent much of his youth in exile in Normandy, brought with him strong Norman influences, which would have profound consequences for England's future. His reign was largely peaceful, but it was also marked by a growing power struggle between the old Anglo-Saxon nobility, particularly the powerful Godwin family, and the Norman favourites Edward brought to his court. The Viking Age, for England, was a period of immense upheaval, transformation, and ultimately resilience. It reshaped the political landscape, introduced new cultural elements, and forged a stronger, more unified English identity in the crucible of conflict. The legacy of the Vikings is still visible in the language, the place names, and even the legal traditions of England. It was a time when the fate of an island hung in the balance, a story of survival, adaptation, and the enduring spirit of a people facing an overwhelming threat from across the sea. The echoes of their longships on the shore would fade, but the imprint of their presence would remain, woven into the very fabric of medieval England. The year 1066 dawned with an air of foreboding, a sense of destiny hanging heavy over the English Channel. King Edward the Confessor, a pious and gentle ruler, had died childless on January 5th, leaving a vacuum that would plunge England into a maelstrom of ambition and conquest. His last days were spent in a haze of prophetic visions, some say, murmuring about the wrath to come, a land delivered into the hands of its enemies. The Witenagemot, the Assembly of Wise Men, swiftly elected Harold Godwinson, the most powerful earl in England, to succeed him. Harold, a man of immense strength and political acumen, had already proven his military prowess and administrative skill. He was crowned king in Westminster Abbey on January 6th, the very day of Edward's burial, a swift transition designed to secure the realm. But across the narrow sea in the Duchy of Normandy, another man harboured a deep conviction that the English throne was his by right. William, Duke of Normandy, a formidable warrior and shrewd politician, claimed that Edward had promised him the crown years earlier, a promise allegedly reaffirmed by Harold himself during a shipwreck in Normandy around 1064. Whether Harold's oath was given under duress, or indeed if it was ever truly made in the way William presented it, remains a point of scholarly dispute. Some historians argue that Harold, as a captive, had no real choice but to swear fealty to William and acknowledge his claim, making any such oath invalid. Others suggest the oath was a genuine, if politically expedient, concession at the time, later renounced. Whatever the truth, William seized upon this claim with unwavering resolve, rallying his Norman barons and an assortment of adventurers from across Europe to prepare for an invasion. The summer of 1066 was a period of agonizing suspense for Harold. He knew William was preparing, and he also knew of another threat brewing in the north. Harald Hardrada, the formidable king of Norway, a Viking warrior of legendary stature, who also laid claim to the English throne, backed by Harold Godwinson's own estranged brother, Tostig. Harold stationed his forces on the south coast, watching the winds, waiting for William's fleet. But the winds blew from the north, not the south. In September, news arrived that Harald Hardrada and Tostig had landed in the Humber estuary, devastating the northern shires. Harold, displaying incredible speed and determination, marched his army over 180 miles in just 4 days, catching the invaders by surprise at the Battle of Stamford Bridge on September 25th. It was a brutal, decisive victory for the English. Both Hardrada and Tostig were killed, and the Norwegian invasion was crushed. The English celebrated, exhausted but triumphant. Yet as the echoes of battle faded, a new, more ominous whisper reached Harold's ears. William's fleet had landed at Pevensey Bay in Sussex on September 28th. The winds had finally shifted. William, having patiently waited for favourable conditions, had crossed the Channel unopposed, establishing a secure beachhead and building a prefabricated wooden castle at Hastings. Harold, having just fought a devastating battle in the north, was faced with an impossible choice. He could have waited, gathered more troops, rested his weary men, but William was ravaging the fertile lands of Sussex, provoking Harold to action. The English king, perhaps driven by a sense of duty to protect his people, perhaps by an overconfidence born of his recent victory, immediately turned his army south, embarking on another forced march, this time covering approximately 250 miles in just over 2 weeks. The two armies met on October 14th, 1066, on Senlac Hill, a ridge 7 miles northwest of Hastings. The English, formed into a formidable shield wall, were primarily infantry, armed with axes and spears, fighting on their home ground with fierce determination. The Normans, a combined force of cavalry, archers, and infantry, near and well-equipped. The battle raged for most of the day, a brutal attritional struggle. The English shield wall held firm against repeated Norman charges. Norman feigned retreats, a tactic designed to break the English formation, eventually began to have an effect. As English soldiers broke ranks to pursue what they thought were fleeing Normans, they were cut down by the returning cavalry. As dusk approached, the tide of battle slowly turned. The English, exhausted and depleted, began to waver. Then a fateful arrow, or perhaps a spear, struck Harold in the eye. Or perhaps he was cut down by Norman knights as the shield wall finally broke. The exact circumstances of his death are another point of historical contention, with accounts varying even in contemporary sources. The Bayeux Tapestry, a remarkable embroidered narrative of the Conquest, depicts Harold with an arrow in his eye, then being cut down by 4 knights. Regardless of the precise manner, Harold Godwinson fell, and with him, the last vestiges of Anglo-Saxon resistance. The English army, leaderless and broken, fled into the gathering darkness. The Battle of Hastings was not merely a battle, it was a cataclysm. William, now known as William the Conqueror, marched on London, receiving the submission of the remaining English magnates. He was crowned King of England on Christmas Day, 1066, in Westminster Abbey, the same place Harold had been crowned less than a year before. The coronation itself was a chaotic affair, with Norman soldiers outside mistaking the cheers within for an uprising and setting fire to nearby houses, causing panic among the congregation. This fiery beginning was perhaps an omen of the tumultuous changes to come. The Norman conquest was far more than a change of kings. It was a profound and irreversible transformation of English society, culture, and language. William, a ruthless but effective ruler, immediately set about consolidating his power. He confiscated the lands of those who had fought against him, distributing them to his loyal Norman followers. This created a new Norman aristocracy, a ruling class that spoke French, built castles, and introduced a new, more centralized form of feudalism. Under the Anglo-Saxons, land ownership had been complex, with various forms of tenure and obligations. The Normans streamlined this system, imposing a rigid feudal hierarchy. The king owned all the land, granting large estates to his most powerful barons, tenants-in-chief, in exchange for military service, loyalty, and financial aid. These barons, in turn, subdivided their land among their own vassals, knights and lesser lords, who owed them similar services. At the bottom of this pyramid were the vast majority of the population, the peasants, or serfs, who were tied to the land and owed labour and rent to their lord in exchange for protection and the right to cultivate a small plot. This system, while not entirely new to England, became far more entrenched and systematic under the Normans, creating a clear chain of command and a powerful military machine. To document and solidify his control, William ordered the creation of the Domesday Book in 1085 to 1086. This monumental survey, a detailed record of land ownership, resources, and value across England, was unprecedented in its scope and thoroughness. It listed every manor, every plough, every pig, every freeman, and every serf. The very name Domesday reflected its finality and authority, like the Last Judgment, from which no appeal was possible. This incredible document provided William with an unparalleled understanding of his new kingdom's wealth and resources, enabling him to assess taxes more efficiently and exert greater control over his vassals. It is still an invaluable source for understanding 11th century England, offering a snapshot of a society on the cusp of radical change. The impact on language was equally profound. Old English, the language of Beowulf and Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, was gradually supplanted as the language of government, law, and high culture by Norman French. For centuries, England became a trilingual society: Latin for the church and official documents, French for the aristocracy and legal system, and English for the common people. This linguistic stratification led to a massive influx of French vocabulary into English, enriching its lexicon and changing its grammar. Words like justice, parliament, jury, beef, pork, and royal all entered English during this period, reflecting the new social order. Even today, the linguistic legacy of the Norman conquest is evident in the dual vocabulary of English. We have both cow, Old English, and beef, Old French, pig, Old English, and pork, Old French, often with the French-derived word referring to the cooked meat consumed by the elite. Architecturally, the Normans left an indelible mark. They were master builders, constructing hundreds of motte and bailey castles across England, quickly erected wooden fortifications on artificial mounds, which later evolved into formidable stone keeps. These castles, symbols of Norman power and control, dotted the landscape, serving as administrative centres, garrisons, and visible reminders of the new regime. The Tower of London, begun by William the Conqueror, is perhaps the most iconic example of Norman defensive architecture. A massive stone keep designed to intimidate and dominate. Churches and cathedrals were also rebuilt in the Romanesque style, characterized by massive walls, round arches, and sturdy pillars, replacing the lighter, more delicate Anglo-Saxon structures. The conquest also brought England more firmly into the continental European sphere. Before 1066, England had strong ties to Scandinavia and its own distinct cultural identity. After 1066, its focus shifted south, becoming intricately linked with the political and cultural developments of France and the wider European continent. English kings were now also Dukes of Normandy, leading to centuries of Anglo-French conflict and entanglement. The immediate aftermath of the conquest was not without resistance. William faced several rebellions, particularly in the north, which he suppressed with brutal efficiency, famously enacting the Harrowing of the North between 1069 and 1070. This scorched earth campaign devastated vast swathes of northern England, deliberately destroying crops, livestock, and villages to deny rebels sustenance and crush any further opposition. Thousands died of famine, and the region remained depopulated for decades. This act, while securing William's rule, left a deep scar on the landscape and the collective memory of the English people. The social structure of England was profoundly altered. The old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was almost entirely dispossessed and replaced by Normans. This new elite brought with them different customs, laws, and a more centralized administrative system. The Church, too, underwent significant reform, with Norman bishops replacing English ones, and a closer alignment with the papacy in Rome. The role of women also saw subtle changes. While Anglo-Saxon women had enjoyed certain legal rights, including property ownership, the Norman system, with its emphasis on primogeniture and military service, often diminished their independent standing, tying their status more directly to their male relatives. Yet, amidst these sweeping changes, elements of Anglo-Saxon culture persisted, particularly among the common people. English continued to be spoken, evolving and adapting, absorbing French influences while retaining its Germanic core. Local customs and traditions, though often overlaid with Norman practices, did not entirely vanish. The very resilience of the English language, surviving centuries of foreign domination, is a testament to the enduring spirit of the conquered. The Norman conquest, therefore, was a pivotal moment, a true turning point in English history. It fundamentally reshaped England's political landscape, establishing a new monarchy and a more centralized feudal system. It irrevocably altered the social hierarchy, replacing an Anglo-Saxon aristocracy with a Norman one. It transformed the English language, injecting a vast vocabulary of French origin that continues to define it today. It brought new architectural styles, new legal systems, and a new orientation towards continental Europe. The echoes of 1066 resonated for centuries, shaping the very identity of England and its place in the world. Perhaps these changes, though born of conquest and violence, ultimately forged a stronger, more complex, and more enduring nation, a crucible in which diverse elements were melted down and reformed into something new. The quiet fields of Hastings, where Harold fell, became the birthplace of a new England, forever changed by the arrival of William and his Norman knights. The Norman conquest, a seismic shift in England's destiny, had irrevocably tied the island kingdom to the continent. William the Conqueror's successors, though often embroiled in their own struggles for power, maintained a presence in Normandy, a constant reminder of their dual identity as English kings and Norman dukes. But the true expansion of this continental ambition, the forging of an empire that would dwarf even William's considerable holdings, would arrive with a new dynasty, one whose very name whispered of a flowering broom plant, Plantagenista, the Plantagenets. The man who would lay the foundation for this sprawling domain was Henry II, a figure of immense energy and restless intellect, who ascended to the English throne in 1154. His inheritance was already impressive. Through his mother, Matilda, he claimed England and Normandy. Through his father, Geoffrey of Anjou, he held Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. But Henry was not content to merely inherit. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most remarkable women of the age, brought with it the vast Duchy of Aquitaine, stretching from the Loire to the Pyrenees. Suddenly, A king of England controlled more land in France than the French king himself. This was the birth of the Angevin Empire, a loose confederation of territories united by their allegiance to Henry, a domain that stretched from the Scottish borders to the sun-drenched plains of Gascony. Imagine the tapestry of cultures, languages, and legal traditions woven into this single, sprawling realm. English, Norman French, Occitan, and Latin would have mingled in the courts and markets of this vast dominion. Henry, a man of formidable administrative skill, sought to bring order and a degree of centralized control to his disparate lands. He was a tireless traveller, constantly moving between his various territories, a whirlwind of legal reforms and military campaigns. His legal innovations, particularly the development of common law and the use of juries, began to lay the groundwork for a more uniform system of justice across England, a legacy that endures to this day. He sought to replace the often arbitrary justice of feudal lords with a system that, while still imperfect, aimed at greater fairness and consistency, offered a greater degree of predictability and royal oversight. Yet this very ambition, this drive for royal supremacy, inevitably brought Henry into conflict with powerful forces within his own realm. The Church, a formidable institution with its own courts, laws, and vast landholdings, represented a significant challenge to his authority. At the heart of this struggle was the question of criminus clerks, clerics accused of crimes who, under canon law, were tried in ecclesiastical courts, often escaping the harsher penalties of royal justice. Henry believed that all subjects, regardless of their clerical status, should be subject to royal law. This tension reached its tragic crescendo with Thomas Becket, Henry's former chancellor and close friend, whom the king appointed Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162, hoping to have an ally within the church. Instead, Becket, once a worldly and ambitious courtier, transformed into a fervent defender of ecclesiastical liberties, standing firm against Henry's attempts to assert royal jurisdiction over the clergy. Their clashes became legendary, a battle of wills between two immensely powerful and stubborn men. The Constitutions of Clarendon in 1164, Henry's attempt to codify the customs governing church-state relations, further inflamed the dispute. Becket refused to fully assent, leading to his exile. For 6 long years, the two men remained at odds, their conflict reverberating across Christendom. When Becket finally returned to England in 1170, the truce was fragile. Fresh disputes erupted, and in a moment of frustrated rage, Henry famously exclaimed, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 of his knights, perhaps misunderstanding or deliberately misinterpreting his words, to okay him at his word, they rode to Canterbury and on December the 29th, 1170, brutally murdered Becket within his own cathedral, at the altar steps. The shockwaves of this sacrilegious act were immense. Henry was forced to do public penance, walking barefoot through Canterbury and allowing himself to be scourged by monks, a stark demonstration of the Church's enduring power and the limits of even a mighty king's authority. Becket was canonized a saint just 3 years later, and his tomb at Canterbury became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in medieval Europe. Beyond the Church, Henry also faced constant challenges from his own family. His sons, spurred on by their mother Eleanor, were perpetually rebellious, vying for power and territory within the Angevin Empire. Richard, Geoffrey, and John, often supported by the French king, engaged in a series of revolts that plagued Henry's later years. It was a cruel irony that the man who had built such a vast domain found his greatest struggles within his own household. Henry died in 1189, a broken man, reportedly lamenting, "Shame on a conquered king." He had spent his life striving for order, only to be betrayed by those closest to him. His eldest surviving son, Richard I, known as the Lionheart, inherited the Angevin Empire. Richard was the quintessential knightly king, a charismatic warrior whose heart was set not on the administration of his vast territories, but on the Crusades. He spent only a few months of his 10-year reign in England, viewing it largely as a source of revenue for his military adventures. His absence, though romanticized in later legends, placed immense strain on the kingdom. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman of extraordinary political acumen, often stepped into the breach, acting as regent and managing the affairs of the realm with remarkable skill. Richard's crusading zeal, while earning him immense fame across Europe, also led to one of the more peculiar episodes of medieval royal history: his capture and ransom. On his way back from the Third Crusade in 1192, he was captured by Duke Leopold V of Austria and later handed over to Emperor Henry VI. The ransom demanded was enormous. Short and pointed when things come to an end. 150,000 marks of silver, a sum equivalent to roughly 2 or 3 times the annual income of the English crown. To raise this staggering amount, every segment of English society was taxed heavily. A quarter of all movable property was demanded from the clergy and laity. Scutage, a payment in lieu of military service, was levied, and even the gold and silver from churches were melted down. The people of England, despite the burden, largely rallied to their king, demonstrating a nascent sense of national identity, perhaps tied to the heroic image of their absent monarch. Richard was eventually released in 1194, but his remaining years were spent largely in France, defending his continental possessions against the machinations of the French king, Philip Augustus. He died in 1199, struck by a crossbow bolt during a siege in Limousin, leaving no legitimate heir. His death marked a turning point, ushering in the tumultuous reign of his younger brother, John. King John, often depicted as a villain in popular history, inherited an empire already teetering on the brink. He lacked the charisma and military prowess of his brother, and his reign was marked by a series of disastrous decisions. His conflict with Philip Augustus of France escalated, leading to the loss of Normandy and most of the other continental possessions of the Angevin Empire by 1204. This was a monumental blow, effectively shrinking the English crown's continental holdings to Gascony in the southwest. The loss of Normandy, in particular, severed a deep and ancient connection, forcing the English aristocracy, many of whom held lands on both sides of the Channel, to choose their allegiance. This geographical contraction, ironically, may have inadvertently strengthened England's identity as a distinct island. The nation, turning its focus inward. John's reign was also characterized by intense conflict with the church and his own barons. His dispute with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury led to England being placed under an interdict in 1208, forbidding most religious services, and John himself was excommunicated. This spiritual isolation was deeply unsettling to a devout medieval populace. He eventually capitulated to the Pope, accepting England and Ireland as papal fiefs, a humiliating concession that further eroded his standing. But it was his relationship with his barons that would define his legacy. John's incessant demands for money to fund his failed military campaigns in France, coupled with his arbitrary rule and disregard for feudal custom, pushed the powerful English nobility to their breaking point. They felt their traditional rights and privileges were being trampled upon. The barons, uniting in a rare display of solidarity, rose in rebellion. In 1215, at Runnymede, a meadow by the River Thames, they forced John to affix his royal seal to a document that would become one of the foundational texts of English law and constitutional government, Magna Carta, or the Great Charter. This document was not a declaration of universal rights as we understand them today. It was primarily a feudal contract, a list of grievances, and a reassertion of traditional baronial liberties against an overreaching king. It guaranteed certain rights to free men, limited the king's ability to levy taxes without consent, protected property rights, and established principles of due process, famously stating that no free man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any other way. Nor will we proceed with force against him, or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. While initially a pragmatic solution to a specific political crisis, often ignored or reissued in modified forms by subsequent monarchs, Magna Carta's long-term significance cannot be overstated. It established the principle that even the king was subject to the law, a revolutionary idea in an age of absolute monarchy. It laid the groundwork for future demands for parliamentary government and individual liberties, becoming a powerful symbol of resistance against tyranny. Historians still debate the extent to which the barons truly understood the long-term implications of their actions, or if they were simply seeking to restore a perceived golden age of feudal custom. Regardless, its impact on the trajectory of English history was profound, a ripple effect that would eventually touch shores far beyond the Thames. John died in 1216, his reign ending amidst civil war. His 9-year-old son, Henry III, inherited a kingdom in turmoil, but one that was slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to define itself anew. The loss of the Angevin Empire, though initially a disaster, allowed England to consolidate its identity, to focus its energies on its own internal development. The Plantagenet dynasty, though it had lost its continental heartland, would continue to rule England for another 2 centuries, shaping its laws, its institutions, and its very sense of self. The grand imperial ambitions of Henry II had given way to a more insular, yet ultimately more unified kingdom. The echoes of Runnymede, though faint at first, would grow louder with each passing century, whispering of a future where power was shared and even kings were held accountable. The vastness of the Angevin Empire had fractured, but in its fragmentation, something new and distinctly English began to emerge from the fertile soil of medieval upheaval. The land itself, once a mere stepping stone to continental power, now began to truly claim its place as the heart of a kingdom. The tapestry of English history, woven with threads of conquest and consolidation, now began to fray under the heavy hand of a king whose reign would forever be etched in the annals of both infamy and unexpected progress. John, the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, ascended to the throne in 1199, inheriting a kingdom still grappling with the financial burdens of his brother Richard's crusades and wars. He was a monarch whose temperament was as volatile as the English Channel, and his reign would be a tempestuous journey through miscalculation, rebellion, and ultimately a reluctant concession that would reshape the very fabric of governance. John's early years on the throne were marked by a series of diplomatic and military blunders that quickly eroded his authority and popular support. His conflict with Philip II of France over the vast Angevin territories on the continent proved disastrous. By 1204, John had lost Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and Touraine, ancestral lands that had been integral to the English crown for over a century. This catastrophic loss, earning him the derisive moniker John Lackland in some circles, was not merely a blow to his prestige. It was a profound financial and strategic setback. The revenues from these fertile French territories had been a significant source of royal income, and their loss forced John to seek ever more aggressive ways to extract funds from his English subjects. His methods were often arbitrary and severe. He imposed heavy taxes, known as scutage, on his barons, demanding payments in lieu of military service, even when no campaigns were being waged. He exploited feudal dues to their fullest, demanding exorbitant fees for inheritances, wardships, and marriages. Royal justice, once a source of stability, became another avenue for financial gain, with fines and forfeitures often outweighing the pursuit of equitable judgment. The chroniclers of the time, often writing with a bias against a king they deeply mistrusted, painted a picture of a monarch consumed by greed and suspicion, a man who alienated nearly everyone he encountered. One particularly significant conflict that further isolated John was his bitter dispute with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury. When the monks of Canterbury elected their own candidate and John insisted on his own choice, the Pope intervened, appointing Stephen Lankan, a learned and respected scholar, to the post. John, in a fit of royal pique, refused to accept Lankan and seized the revenues of the archbishopric. In response, Innocent III placed England under an interdict in 1208, a severe spiritual penalty that forbade most church services, including baptisms, marriages, and burials, across the entire kingdom. Imagine the hushed terror that must have descended upon villages and towns, the fear of unbaptized infants and the unblessed dead, as the bells of the churches fell silent. 2 years later, the Pope excommunicated John himself, effectively casting him out of the Christian community and releasing his subjects from their oaths of fealty. This was a direct challenge to John's divine right to rule, and it sent shivers through the superstitious populace and emboldened his growing list of enemies. Faced with the threat of a French invasion, sanctioned by the Pope, John finally capitulated in 1213, submitting to Innocent III and accepting Stephen Lankan as Archbishop. He even went so far as to declare England a papal fief, offering an annual tribute to Rome, a move that further infuriated his barons, who saw it as a humiliating surrender of English sovereignty. These cumulative grievances, the loss of French lands, the oppressive taxation, the arbitrary justice, and the humiliation at the hands of the Pope, festered among the English barons. They were not seeking to overthrow the monarchy, but rather to curb its excesses and establish a clear framework of rights and responsibilities. The barons, of whom had suffered directly from John's capricious rule, began to organize, their discontent coalescing into a powerful demand for reform. The spring of 1215 saw the climax of this growing rebellion. A large contingent of barons, led by men like Robert Fitzwalter, renounced their fealty to John and marched on London, which opened its gates to them. John, isolated and without significant military support, found himself in an untenable position. He had little choice but to negotiate. The stage for this historic confrontation was set in a meadow beside the River Thames, near Windsor, known as Runnymede. On June the 15th, 1215, under a sky that perhaps mirrored the tense atmosphere, King John affixed his royal seal to a document that would forever alter the course of English law and governance, Magna Carta, or the Great Charter. Magna Carta was not, in its initial form, a grand statement of universal human rights, as it is often romanticized today. It was primarily a peace treaty, a pragmatic document drafted by the barons and Archbishop Stephen Langton, designed to address specific grievances and protect the feudal rights of the nobility. However, its implications reached far beyond the immediate concerns of the 13th century aristocracy. The Charter contained 63 clauses, many of which dealt with highly specific feudal customs and regulations concerning scutage, reliefs, and wardships. Yet, nestled among these technical details were revolutionary principles that would resonate through the centuries. Clause 39, for instance, declared, "No free man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any other way. Nor will we proceed with force against him, or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land." This was a foundational statement of due process, establishing the right to a fair trial and protection against arbitrary arrest. Clause 40 proclaimed, "To no one will we sell, to no one deny or delay right or justice." This enshrined the principle that justice should be accessible to all free men, without bribery or undue delay. While free men, in 1215, constituted a relatively small portion of the population, the vast majority was still unfree serfs tied to the land. The concept itself was a powerful seed of future legal equality. Another crucial aspect was the establishment of a council of 25 barons, who were empowered to ensure the king's compliance with the charter. If John failed to uphold its provisions, this council had the right to seize his lands and possessions until he complied. This was an unprecedented limitation on royal power, effectively placing the king beneath the law and introducing a mechanism for accountability. It was a radical departure from the prevailing notion of absolute monarchy, where the king was considered to be above the law. John, however, had no intention of abiding by the charter's terms for long. He immediately appealed to Pope Innocent III, who, viewing the document as an affront to royal authority and an attack on his vassal, promptly annulled Magna Carta, declaring it null and void of all validity forever. This ignited the First Barons' War, a brutal conflict that plunged England back into civil strife. Yet, even in its annulment, Magna Carta's spirit endured. When John died suddenly in 1216, leaving his 9-year-old son, Henry III, to inherit a kingdom in chaos, the regents governing on the young king's behalf quickly reissued a modified version of the charter. They understood that securing the support of the barons was essential for the stability of the realm. Over the next few decades, Magna Carta was reissued multiple times, each iteration slightly refined, becoming a cornerstone of English law. It was even sent out to all the sheriffs to be read aloud in every county court, ensuring its principles, if not its every clause, became known throughout the land. The legacy of Magna Carta is immense and far-reaching. It established the fundamental principle that even the king was subject to the law, a concept known as the rule of law. It laid the groundwork for constitutional governance, limiting the arbitrary power of the monarch and protecting the rights of individuals, at least those considered free. While it did not create democracy overnight, it planted the seeds for future demands for greater representation and accountability. Indeed, historians still disagree whether the barons of 1215 truly understood the long-term implications of the document they forced upon John, or if they were simply seeking to restore traditional feudal rights that John had violated. Some scholars argue that its significance was largely retroactively applied, becoming a symbol of liberty in later centuries. Others contend that the foundational principles of due process and limited government were inherently revolutionary, even if their immediate application was narrow. Regardless of the intent, its enduring power lies in its adaptability and its symbolic resonance as a bulwark against tyranny. The immediate aftermath of Magna Carta and John's death saw England under the regency of William Marshal, a legendary knight whose loyalty and wisdom helped stabilize the realm. But the idea of a council of barons, however imperfectly implemented in 1215, foreshadowed the development of a more formal advisory body that would eventually evolve into Parliament. During the reign of Henry III, John's son, the concept of a royal council, or magnum concilium, began to take on a more defined role. Henry III, much like his father, faced financial difficulties and strained relations with his barons. He was often perceived as being too heavily influenced by foreign advisors and too eager to fund costly ventures in Sicily. His extravagant spending and perceived disregard for English customs led to renewed baronial discontent. In 1258, a group of powerful barons, led by Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, forced Henry III to accept the provisions of Oxford. This document effectively placed the king under the control of a council of 15 barons, who were to oversee royal administration, appoint ministers, and control the royal treasury. It also stipulated that Parliament, a term that was then used to describe a gathering of the king's council and other leading men, should meet 3 times a year to discuss matters of the realm. This was a significant step towards institutionalizing a regular forum for consultation and governance. The provisions of Oxford, however, proved too radical for some and too restrictive for the king, leading to another period of civil unrest known as the Second Barons' War, 1264 to 1267. Simon de Montfort emerged as a dominant figure, and in 1265, during a period when he effectively controlled the government, he summoned a parliament that was truly groundbreaking. De Montfort's parliament included not only the traditional great barons and bishops, but also representatives from the shires, knights, and crucially, from the boroughs, burgesses. This inclusion of commoners, elected representatives from towns and cities, was a revolutionary innovation. While de Montfort's motives were likely pragmatic, he needed broader support for his regime. This act laid the foundation for the representative assembly that would become the English Parliament. Imagine the bustling streets of London, the arrival of knights from distant shires, and merchants from thriving towns, all converging to discuss the affairs of the kingdom, their voices adding a new dimension to the ancient councils of kings and nobles. Though de Montfort's rebellion was ultimately crushed, and he was killed at the Battle of Evesham in 1265, his parliamentary innovations were not entirely forgotten. Edward I, Henry III's son and successor, a strong and astute monarch, recognized the utility of summoning representatives from the shires and boors. Oggs. He understood that securing wider consent for taxation and legislation made it easier to govern and to raise funds for his ambitious military campaigns, particularly against Wales and Scotland. In 1295, Edward I summoned what became known as the Model Parliament. This assembly included archbishops, bishops, abbots, earls, and barons, along with 2 knights from each shire and 2 burgesses from each city and borough. This structure, with its 2 distinct houses, the lords, clergy and nobility, and the commons, knights and burgesses, began to take shape. The Model Parliament was not a democratic institution in the modern sense. Its primary purpose was to grant taxes to the king. However, it formalized the practice of representation and established a forum where grievances could be aired and royal policies debated, even if only in a limited capacity. The emergence of Parliament was a gradual process, not a sudden creation. It evolved from the king's ancient council, shaped by the demands of the barons, the pressures of war, and the need for royal finance. Its development was intertwined with the principles enshrined in Magna Carta, particularly the idea that the king should consult with his leading subjects and that there were limits to his power. The story of Parliament's birth is a testament to the slow, often contentious, unfolding of political institutions. It was a journey from absolute monarchy to a system where the monarch shared power, however reluctantly at first, with representatives of the realm. These early parliaments, meeting in various locations, often Westminster, were vibrant, if sometimes chaotic, gatherings. Knights and burgesses, accustomed to managing local affairs, brought their practical concerns to the national stage. Their presence slowly shifted the balance of power, creating a new dynamic in English governance. The seeds sown at Runnymede in 1215, nurtured through years of baronial struggle and royal necessity, blossomed into a parliamentary system that would eventually become a model for representative government around the world. From the arbitrary rule of King John, through the reluctant concessions of Magna Carta, to the innovative summons of Simon de Montfort and the strategic consolidations of Edward I. The foundations of a limited monarchy and a representative legislature were slowly but surely laid. The English monarchy, once absolute in theory, was now bound by a charter and increasingly accountable to a body that spoke for the realm, whispering the promise of a future where power would be shared, and the voices of the people, however few at first, would begin to be heard. The echoes of the Magna Carta, though still faint, had begun to resonate through the halls of power, shaping the very idea of English governance. But as the 14th century dawned, a new and far more brutal chapter was about to unfold, one that would test the very fabric of the nation and leave an indelible mark on its soul. This was the era of the 100 Years' War, a conflict so vast and protracted that its name alone evokes a sense of weary endurance. It began, as so many conflicts do, with a tangled web of dynastic claims and feudal obligations. The English kings, descendants of William the Conqueror, still held significant territories in France, a legacy that perpetually chafed against the burgeoning power of the French monarchy. When the French King Charles IV died without a direct male heir in 1328, Edward III of England, whose mother Isabella was Charles's sister, laid claim to the French throne. The French nobility, however, invoked Salic law, which forbade inheritance through the female line, and crowned Philip VI, a cousin, instead. This spark of succession dispute, fanned by economic rivalries over Flanders and Gascony, ignited a conflagration that would burn for over a century. The early years of the war saw remarkable English victories, largely due to innovative military tactics. At the Battle of Crecy in 1346, English longbowmen, with their devastating range and rate of fire, decimated the much larger French army, whose heavily armoured knights proved vulnerable to the hail of arrows. 10 years later, at Poitiers in 1356, the English repeated this feat, even capturing the French king, John II, a humiliation that sent shockwaves across Europe. These battles were not just clashes of arms. They were clashes of military philosophy, demonstrating the growing obsolescence of traditional feudal cavalry against a disciplined professional infantry. The longbow, a weapon requiring immense strength and years of training, became a symbol of English martial prowess, and its impact on the battlefield was revolutionary. Yet, even as English armies tasted victory, a far more insidious enemy was making its way across the continent, an enemy that cared nothing for kings or crowns, for borders or battles. This was the Black Death, a plague of such terrifying virulence that it would reshape the demographics and psychology of Europe in ways no war ever could. Arriving in England in 1348, carried by fleas on rats aboard merchant ships, it spread with horrifying speed through the crowded towns and villages. The symptoms were gruesome: fever, chills, vomiting, and the telltale buboes, swollen, painful lymph nodes that gave the bubonic plague its name. Death often came within days, sometimes hours. The scale of the mortality was almost incomprehensible. Historians estimate that between 30% and 50% of England's population perished in the initial wave of the Black Death, and subsequent outbreaks continued to plague the country for decades. Imagine entire villages emptied, fields lying fallow, churches without congregations. The social order, already strained by war, buckled under the weight of such profound loss. Labourers became scarce, their sudden value giving them an unprecedented bargaining power. Wages soared, much to the dismay of the landowning gentry, who tried to impose wage freezes through legislation like the Statute of Labourers in 1351. But the laws were largely unenforceable in the face of such a drastic demographic shift. This demographic upheaval had profound economic consequences. With fewer people to work the land, some marginal lands were abandoned, and a shift occurred from arable farming to sheep rearing, which required less labour. The surviving peasantry, no longer tied to their lords by the same desperate need, began to demand better conditions, leading to increased social mobility and a gradual erosion of the feudal system. The old hierarchies, though still powerful, were beginning to crack under the strain. The Black Death also cast a long, dark shadow over the human spirit. How had such a catastrophe been understood? For many, it was seen as divine punishment, leading to a surge in religious fervour, flagellant movements, and a desperate search for meaning in the face of overwhelming suffering. Others, however, lost faith, turning to hedonism or despair. The plague left an enduring psychological scar, a collective trauma that permeated art, literature, and daily life. The Dance of Death, or Danse Macabre, became a popular artistic motif, depicting skeletons leading people from all walks of life to their graves, a stark reminder of mortality's indiscriminate embrace. The 100 Years' War, meanwhile, continued its grinding course. Despite early English successes, the tide began to turn. The French, under figures like Bertrand du Guesclin, adopted a strategy of attrition, avoiding pitched battles and focusing on raiding English-held territories. The war became a drain on English resources, and the initial enthusiasm waned. The reigns of Richard II and Henry IV saw periods of internal strife and a temporary lull in major campaigning. A lesser-known detail from this period is the role of the free companies, or routiers. These were mercenary bands, often composed of soldiers whose contracts had expired, who roamed the French countryside, plundering and pillaging. They were a scourge to the civilian population, often more feared than the official armies, and their existence highlights the brutal reality of prolonged warfare and the breakdown of central authority in war-torn regions. These companies were a constant source of instability, complicating the lives of ordinary people caught between warring factions and opportunistic brigands. The early 15th century saw a resurgence of English fortunes under the charismatic leadership of Henry V. His stunning victory at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, another triumph for the English longbow against overwhelming French numbers, is etched into English national memory. This victory, achieved against incredible odds, led to the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which named Henry V as regent and heir to the French throne. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as if the English dream of a dual monarchy uniting the crowns of England and France might actually be realised. But fate, and a young peasant girl from Domremy, had other plans. Joan of Arc, a figure of extraordinary conviction and courage, emerged from obscurity in 1429, claiming divine guidance to save France. Her appearance galvanized the demoralized French forces, leading to the lifting of the Siege of Orléans and the coronation of Charles VII at Reims. Her story, though tragically cut short by her capture and execution by the English, ignited a fervent French nationalism that ultimately proved irresistible. Historians still debate the true extent of Joan of Arc's military genius versus her symbolic power. Was she a brilliant strategist, or primarily a figurehead whose unwavering faith inspired a weary nation to believe in itself once more? Perhaps it was a potent combination of both, a testament to the power of belief in the darkest of times. Regardless, her impact was undeniable. The tide of the war definitively turned, and the English, slowly but surely, were pushed back. By the mid-15th century, English possessions in France had dwindled to just Calais. The 100 Years' War, a conflict that had begun with such ambition, ended not with a grand treaty, but with a slow, grinding withdrawal. The final battle, Castillon, in 1453, was a decisive French victory, notable for being one of the first battles where gunpowder artillery played a crucial role, signalling the end of the Age of the Knight and the longbow. The legacy of the 100 Years' War and the Black Death was profound. Demographically, England was a vastly different place, with a smaller, more mobile population. Economically, the old feudal structures were weakened, giving rise to a more commercial economy and a stronger emphasis on individual labour. Socially, the peasantry gained greater leverage, and a nascent middle class began to emerge. Culturally, the war fostered a distinct English identity, separate from its continental neighbours. The English language, once overshadowed by French in aristocratic circles, rose to prominence, becoming the language of law, literature, and government. Chaucer, writing in the late 14th century, is a testament to this linguistic shift. His Canterbury Tales capturing the vibrant tapestry of English society in the vernacular. The protracted conflict also had a significant impact on the English monarchy and Parliament. The king's constant need for funds to finance the war led to more frequent summoning of Parliament, which gradually gained more influence and asserted its right to approve taxation. This ongoing dialogue, often contentious, between monarch and representative body, laid further groundwork for the development of parliamentary power, building upon the foundations established by the Magna Carta. The psychological toll of these two immense forces, war and plague, is harder to quantify, but no less significant. A generation grew up knowing only conflict, loss, and uncertainty. The world felt precarious, and the old certainties had been shaken to their core. Yet, out of this crucible of suffering and change, a new England was slowly being forged, one that would look increasingly inward, focusing on its own island destiny rather than its continental ambitions. As the last English soldiers retreated from France, leaving behind centuries of claims and conflicts, England was left to contend with the internal changes wrought by these seismic events. The demography had shifted, the economy had evolved, and the very concept of nationhood had been sharpened by the crucible of war and plague. The stage was now set for new challenges, new conflicts, and new chapters in the unfolding story of this island nation. The fields that had once been tilled by countless hands now lay fallow, whispering tales of those who had vanished, while new voices, emboldened by scarcity and change, began to demand their place in the sun. The scars of the 14th and 15th centuries were deep, but they also marked the beginning of a profound transformation, steering England towards a future distinct from its medieval past. The scent of blooming roses, one red, one white, might have been a beautiful symbol of unity, but in the mid-15th century, they became the bitter emblems of a nation tearing itself apart. The Wars of the Roses, a dynastic struggle between two branches of the Plantagenet family, the House of Lancaster, represented by a red rose, and the House of York by a white, plunged England into a brutal civil war that would last for over 3 decades. It was a conflict born from a complex tapestry of ambition, weak leadership, and the lingering resentments of a powerful, often unruly nobility. The seeds of this discord were sown during the reign of Henry VI, a king whose piety was matched only by his profound unsuitability for rule. Crowned King of England at just 9 months old in 1422, and King of France shortly thereafter, Henry inherited a realm still reeling from the 100 Years' War. But unlike his formidable father, Henry V, Henry VI was a gentle, scholarly man, prone to periods of mental instability. His wife, Margaret of Anjou, a fierce and politically astute queen, often had to step into the void left by her husband's incapacities, a role that many of the English nobility resented deeply. They saw her as an interfering foreigner, especially as she sought to protect her son's claim to the throne against the rising influence of Richard, Duke of York. Richard of York was a formidable figure, a great-grandson of Edward III through both his father and his mother, giving him a strong claim to the throne, arguably stronger than Henry VI through primogeniture. He was a capable military commander and administrator, and many nobles looked to him for strong leadership, especially as England's fortunes in France dwindled. When Henry VI suffered a complete mental breakdown in 1453, Becoming utterly unresponsive to the world around him, Richard was appointed protector of the realm. For a brief period, it seemed as though stability might return. However, Henry's unexpected recovery in 1455 and Queen Margaret's immediate efforts to restore Lancastrian power and marginalise York ignited the powder keg. The first clash, often considered the formal start of the Wars of the Roses, occurred at St Albans in May 1455. It was a relatively small engagement, but its consequences were immense. Richard of York, along with his powerful allies, the Neville family, particularly Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, later known as the Kingmaker, confronted the king's forces. The Lancastrians were defeated, and several prominent Lancastrian lords were killed. Henry VI himself was wounded and captured, effectively becoming a pawn in York's hands. This battle marked a critical turning point. The nobility had taken up arms against their anointed king, shattering the fragile peace and setting a dangerous precedent. The years that followed were a dizzying dance of shifting allegiances, brutal battles, and temporary truces. The conflict was not a constant, all-encompassing war, but rather a series of intense campaigns punctuated by periods of uneasy peace. Families were torn apart, with brothers fighting on opposing sides. The great feudal lords, with their retinues of armed men, held immense power, and their loyalties often dictated the course of events. The common people, while not always directly involved in the fighting, suffered greatly from the instability, the disruption of trade, and the constant fear of plunder and reprisal. One of the most defining figures of this era was Warwick the Kingmaker. His vast estates and military prowess made him the most powerful magnate in England. He initially supported Richard of York, helping him achieve victory at St Albans and later at the Battle of Northampton in 1460, where Henry VI was again captured. Following Northampton, Richard of York made a bold claim to the throne, but instead a compromise was reached. Henry would remain king, but York and his heirs would succeed him. This was a direct disinherit. Itance of Henry's son, Edward, Prince of Wales, and Queen Margaret, understandably, refused to accept it. Her determination led to the Battle of Wakefield in December 1460. Margaret gathered a formidable Lancastrian army, and in a decisive victory, Richard of York was killed, along with his second son, Edmund, Earl of Rutland. Their heads were displayed on the city walls of York, a crown of paper mockingly placed on Richard's head. This act of barbarity only intensified the bitterness of the conflict. However, Richard's eldest son, Edward, Earl of March, was a capable and charismatic leader. He swiftly avenged his father's death, winning a series of victories that culminated in the devastating Battle of Towton in March 1461. Towton was one of the largest and bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil, fought in a blinding snowstorm on Palm Sunday. Estimates suggest that over 50,000 men were involved, with casualties potentially reaching 28,000. The Lancastrian army was utterly crushed, and their cause seemed lost. Following this decisive victory, Edward IV, the young, handsome, and militarily brilliant son of Richard of York, was crowned King of England. He was the first Yorkist monarch, and his reign initially brought a measure of stability. Though Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou remained a threat, seeking refuge in Scotland and later France, Edward IV, however, soon found himself at odds with his most powerful ally, Warwick. The reasons for their estrangement are complex, but largely revolved around Edward's foreign policy and his marriage. Edward secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner and a widow with children, in 1464. This infuriated Warwick, who had been negotiating a French alliance for Edward through a marriage to a French princess. Warwick saw the Woodville family as upstarts, and their rapid rise to power at court further alienated him. He felt his influence waning and believed Edward was ungrateful for his role in placing him on the throne. This simmering resentment eventually boiled over, and Warwick, the kingmaker, famously switched his allegiance. In a stunning turn of events, he allied himself with his former enemy, Margaret of Anjou, and even married his daughter to her son, Prince Edward. With French support, Warwick launched an invasion in 1470, forcing Edward IV to flee to Burgundy. Henry VI was briefly restored to the throne, a pathetic figure whose mental state had further deteriorated. This period, known as the readaptation of Henry VI, was short-lived. Edward IV, with the support of his brother-in-law, Charles the Bold of Burgundy, returned to England in 1471. He quickly gathered support and confronted Warwick at the Battle of Barnet in April 1471. In a dense fog, Warwick's forces were defeated, and the kingmaker himself was killed. Just weeks later, Edward faced Margaret of Anjou's army, led by her son, Prince Edward, at the Battle of Tewkesbury. The Lancastrians suffered another crushing defeat, and Prince Edward was killed, effectively ending the Lancastrian line. Henry VI, imprisoned in the Tower of London, died shortly after, likely murdered, thus extinguishing the direct Lancastrian claim to the throne. Edward IV's second reign brought a period of relative peace and prosperity. He was a shrewd politician and a capable ruler, restoring order and strengthening the monarchy. He died unexpectedly in 1483, leaving behind two young sons, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, known as the Princes in the Tower. Their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward IV's younger brother, was appointed protector. What followed is one of the most enduring mysteries of English history. Richard swiftly declared his nephews illegitimate, seized the throne for himself as Richard III, and the young princes disappeared from the Tower of London, never to be seen again. Historians still debate vehemently whether Richard III was directly responsible for their murder, or if others, perhaps even Henry Tudor, later King Henry VII, were involved. The lack of definitive evidence has fueled centuries of speculation, making it a compelling, if tragic, enigma. Richard III's reign was short and troubled. Though a capable administrator and a brave warrior, his usurpation and the disappearance of his nephews alienated many. Opposition quickly coalesced around Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian claimant who had spent much of his life in exile. Henry's claim was tenuous, but he represented a potential end to the dynastic strife. He landed in Wales in 1485, gathering support as he marched eastward. The decisive confrontation came at the Battle of Bosworth Field. On a blustery August day in 1485, the two armies met. Richard III, despite being outnumbered, fought bravely, leading a charge directly towards Henry Tudor. However, key allies of Richard, most notably the Stanley family, betrayed him at a critical moment. Switching their allegiance to Henry, Richard III was unhorsed and killed in battle, the last English king to die on the field. His crown, reportedly found in a hawthorn bush, was placed on Henry Tudor's head, marking the end of the Plantagenet dynasty and the beginning of the Tudor era. The Wars of the Roses had a profound impact on England. The old feudal nobility, who had wielded so much power and often challenged the crown, was decimated. Many ancient families were wiped out, their lands and titles confiscated. This weakening of the aristocracy inadvertently strengthened the monarchy, paving the way for the more centralized and absolute rule of the Tudors. The conflict also fostered a deep desire for peace and stability among the populace, making them more amenable to a strong, undisputed monarch. Beyond the political landscape, the wars left scars on the national psyche. The constant shifting of allegiances, the brutal betrayals, and the sheer scale of the bloodshed instilled a sense of weariness and a longing for an end to the seemingly endless cycle of violence. Yet, from this crucible of conflict, a new England would emerge. Henry Tudor, now Henry VII, would marry Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter, symbolically uniting the warring houses and bringing a fragile peace to a nation exhausted by decades of internecine strife. The red rose and the white were finally intertwined, not in battle, but in a new emblem, the Tudor rose, signifying a new beginning. The echoes of those bitter battles, the clashing steel and the cries of dying men, would fade into the memory of the land, leaving behind a legacy of both destruction and ultimately renewal. The medieval age, with its powerful barons and shifting loyalties, was drawing to a close, and the foundations for a new era were being laid amidst the fields of red and white roses. The wind that swept across Bosworth Field on that fateful August morning in 1485 carried more than the dust of battle. It carried the last gasps of a dying age. Richard III, the last Plantagenet king, fell beneath the onslaught of Henry Tudor's forces, his crown famously found later in a hawthorn bush. With his death, the Wars of the Roses, those bitter internecine struggles for the English throne that had bled the nobility for decades, finally drew to a close. Henry Tudor, a man whose claim to the throne was tenuous at best, a descendant through his mother of John of Gaunt's illegitimate line, was now Henry VII, the first of the Tudor monarchs. His victory was not just a change of dynasty. It was a profound turning point, marking the twilight of medieval England and the dawn of a new, more centralized, and ultimately more modern state. Henry VII was a king forged in exile, cautious and shrewd. With a deep understanding of the fragility of power, he knew that his throne, won by conquest, needed to be secured by legitimacy and stability. His first masterstroke was his marriage to Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV and niece of the fallen Richard III. This union, symbolically weaving together the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York, was a powerful act of reconciliation, designed to heal the deep wounds of civil war. Their children, particularly their eldest son Arthur and later Henry, would embody this new, unified lineage. The early years of Henry VII's reign were characterized by a relentless pursuit of order and financial solvency. He was acutely aware that the constant drain of warfare had left the royal coffers depleted. Unlike his predecessors, who often relied on feudal levies and the unpredictable generosity of Parliament, Henry began to build a more robust and independent royal revenue system. He revived old feudal dues, imposed heavy fines for various offences, and meticulously managed the crown lands. His chief financial ministers, men like Empson and Dudley, became notorious for their rigorous, some would say ruthless collection methods, ensuring that money flowed steadily into the royal treasury. This accumulation of wealth was crucial. It allowed Henry to maintain a standing army, fund diplomatic initiatives, and reduce his reliance on a potentially rebellious nobility. He also skillfully dismantled the power bases of the great magnates who had plunged England into chaos. Laws against livery and maintenance, which had allowed nobles to raise private armies and wear their distinctive badges, were strictly enforced. He established the Court of Star Chamber, a royal council that dealt with powerful individuals who might otherwise intimidate local courts. While later becoming a symbol of royal overreach, in Henry VII's time, it served to curb the lawlessness that had plagued the realm. These actions, though sometimes unpopular, laid the groundwork for a more centralized government where the king's authority was paramount, rather than being constantly challenged by powerful regional lords. Henry VII's foreign policy was equally pragmatic. He sought peace and stability through a series of carefully arranged dynastic marriages for his children. His eldest son, Arthur, was betrothed to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the powerful Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, forging a crucial alliance. Though Arthur's untimely death in 1502 shattered this initial plan, Henry, ever the pragmatist, secured a papal dispensation for Catherine to marry his younger son, the future Henry VIII. His daughter Margaret was married to James IV of Scotland, an attempt to bring peace to the turbulent Anglo-Scottish border, though this union would later lead to complex dynastic claims. These marriages, more than mere romantic unions, were intricate chess moves on the European stage, designed to secure England's position and prevent costly wars. When Henry VII died in 1509, he left behind a kingdom that was financially sound, politically stable, and with a significantly strengthened monarchy. He had, in essence, dragged England out of its medieval mire and set it firmly on the path towards a more absolute and modern state. His son, Henry VIII, inherited a full treasury and a relatively peaceful realm, a stark contrast to the warring kingdom his father had seized. Henry VIII, a man of immense charisma, towering intellect, and formidable will, was in many ways the antithesis of his cautious father. He was a Renaissance prince, a scholar, musician, and athlete who initially ruled with a popular touch. He had been groomed for the church before Arthur's death, and his theological knowledge was considerable. His early reign was marked by a desire for glory and a return to continental military adventures, eager to prove himself on the European stage against the likes of Francis I of France and Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire. However, the defining drama of Henry VIII's reign, and indeed one of the most pivotal moments in English history, revolved around his desperate need for a male heir. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon, though initially happy, had produced only one surviving child, a daughter, Mary. As years passed and Catherine entered menopause, the prospect of a male heir seemed increasingly remote. Henry became obsessed with the idea that his marriage was cursed. Citing a passage from Leviticus that prohibited a man from marrying his brother's widow, he argued that the papal dispensation allowing his marriage to Catherine had been invalid, making their union unlawful in God's eyes. This conviction, fueled by his desire for a son and his growing affection for Anne Boleyn, led to what became known as the King's Great Matter. Henry sought an annulment from Pope Clement VII, a process that dragged on for years. The Pope, however, was in a precarious position, effectively a prisoner of Catherine's nephew, Emperor Charles V, and unwilling to offend such a powerful monarch. Henry's frustration grew, and he began to explore radical solutions, advised by ambitious and brilliant minds like Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer. This period saw the gradual but inexorable break with the Roman Catholic Church. Step by step, Parliament, under Henry's immense pressure, passed a series of acts that chipped away at papal authority in England. The Act in Restraint of Appeals, 1533, declared that the English monarch was the supreme head of the Church in England, preventing appeals to Rome. This effectively made England an independent ecclesiastical entity. The following year, the Act of Supremacy, 1534, formally declared Henry VIII and his successors to be the supreme head on earth of the Church of England. This was not merely a theological shift. It was a profound assertion of royal power, consolidating both spiritual and temporal authority in the hands of the monarch. The consequences were far-reaching and immediate. Thomas More, Henry's former Lord Chancellor and a devout Catholic, refused to acknowledge the Act of Supremacy and was executed for treason in 1535. His principled stand, and that of others who resisted, highlighted the seismic shift occurring within English society. The dissolution of the monasteries, initiated in 1536, was another major consequence. These wealthy institutions, which had for centuries been centres of spiritual life, learning, and charity, were seen by Henry and Cromwell as bastions of papal influence and immense sources of untapped wealth. Their lands and assets were seized by the crown, enriching the royal treasury and creating a new class of landowners who benefited directly from the break with Rome, thus tying their fortunes to the new religious order. The English Reformation under Henry VIII was, initially at least, more about politics and power than profound theological change. Henry remained in many ways a Catholic in doctrine, even publishing the 6 Articles in 1539, which reaffirmed many traditional Catholic beliefs like transubstantiation. However, the door had been opened to Protestant ideas, which began to flow more freely into England, particularly from continental Europe. The Bible was translated into English and placed in parish churches, allowing ordinary people to engage with Scripture in their own language, a revolutionary concept that slowly began to reshape popular piety. Henry's personal life continued to be tumultuous. After Anne Boleyn failed to produce a male heir and was accused of treason, she was executed in 1536. His third wife, Jane Seymour, finally gave him the longed-for son, Edward, but died shortly after childbirth. He went on to marry 3 more times, each marriage reflecting different political or personal needs, but none produced further children. The establishment of the Church of England, though driven by Henry's personal desires, inadvertently set England on a path of religious upheaval that would define much of the next century. It fundamentally altered the relationship between the crown and its subjects, empowering the monarchy in unprecedented ways and laying the groundwork for a distinctly English national identity, separate from the broader European Catholic world. Historians still debate the extent to which Henry VIII was a true Protestant reformer, or simply a pragmatic ruler using religious change to secure his dynasty and power. Some argue that his actions were a cynical power grab, while others see him as genuinely convinced of the invalidity of his first marriage and the righteousness of his cause. What is undeniable is that his reign irrevocably changed the religious and political landscape of England, creating a new church and a more powerful crown. The legacy of Henry VIII was a kingdom poised on the brink of significant change. When he died in 1547, his young son, Edward VI, ascended the throne. Edward, a devout Protestant, and his regents, particularly the Duke of Somerset and later the Duke of Northumberland, pushed the Church of England further in a Protestant direction. English became the language of church services. Images were removed from churches, and the Book of Common Prayer, a beautifully crafted liturgy that shaped English worships for centuries, was introduced. This period saw a more radical break from Catholic doctrine and practice than Henry VIII had ever intended. However, Edward's reign was tragically short, and upon his death in 1553, his Catholic half-sister Mary I came to the throne. Mary, fiercely devoted to the Catholic faith, sought to reverse the Reformation and restore England to papal obedience. Her reign was marked by a brutal persecution of Protestants, earning her the chilling moniker Bloody Mary. Hundreds were burned at the stake for heresy, a desperate attempt to stamp out the burgeoning Protestant movement. Yet her efforts ultimately failed. The seeds of Protestantism had been too deeply sown, and the return to Rome was met with significant resistance, particularly among those who had benefited from the dissolution of the monasteries. The constant swings between Protestantism and Catholicism during these years created immense instability and fear within the population. It was a time when one's religious convictions could literally mean the difference between life and death. The question of succession remained paramount, and the prospect of Mary dying childless, leaving the Protestant Elizabeth as her heir, filled both Catholics and Protestants with dread or hope, depending on their faith. When Mary died in 1558, the accession of her half-sister, Elizabeth I, was met with a collective sigh of relief by many. Elizabeth, a shrewd and intelligent monarch, understood the need for religious settlement and stability. She sought a middle path, a via media, that would unite a fractured nation. Her religious settlement, enshrined in the Acts of Supremacy and Uniformity in 1559, re-established the monarch as the supreme governor of the Church of England, a slightly softer title than supreme head, but with the same practical effect, and mandated the use of a revised Book of Common Prayer. Elizabeth's Church of England was Protestant in doctrine, but retained some traditional Catholic elements in its structure and ceremony, designed to be broad enough to accommodate a wide range of religious views, from those who leaned towards Catholicism to those who preferred a more moderate Protestantism. This settlement, though not without its challenges from more radical Protestants, Puritans, and staunch Catholics, brought a much-needed period of religious peace and stability to England, allowing the nation to focus on other matters. The Tudor period, from Henry VII to Elizabeth I, was a transformative era. It saw the consolidation of royal power, the creation of a distinct English church, and the gradual emergence of a national identity. The medieval world, with its fragmented feudal loyalties and universal Catholic Church, had given way to a more centralized, sovereign state. The Tudors, through their strength, cunning, and sometimes their ruthlessness, laid the foundations for England's future as a powerful and independent nation, ready to engage with a rapidly changing world. The echoes of their decisions, particularly the break with Rome, would resonate through English history for centuries to come, shaping its politics, its culture, and its very soul. As the echoes of conflict and the clamour of political manoeuvring began to soften, a deeper, more enduring legacy of medieval England emerged, one woven into the very fabric of daily life, thought, and expression. Beyond the rise and fall of kings, the shifting tides of war, and the intricate dance of power, the medieval period etched an indelible mark on the island's culture, language, architecture, and social structures, laying the groundwork for the nation that would step into the early modern age. One of the most profound transformations was in language. The Norman Conquest had introduced Old French as the language of the court, law, and aristocracy, creating a linguistic chasm between the ruling elite and the Anglo-Saxon populace who spoke Old English. For centuries, these two tongues coexisted, intermingling in a slow, organic process of linguistic evolution. By the 14th century, a new language, Middle English, had fully blossomed, a rich tapestry woven from Germanic roots and French elegance. It was a language capable of immense poetic beauty and practical utility, a testament to the resilience of popular speech and the adaptive power of human communication. Geoffrey Chaucer, often hailed as the father of English literature, became its most celebrated voice, his Canterbury Tales offering a vibrant, multifaceted portrait of medieval society. Told in a language that, while archaic to modern ears, is recognizably the ancestor of contemporary English. His decision to write in the vernacular, rather than Latin or French, was a pivotal moment, elevating English to a literary language of prestige and power. This linguistic shift was not merely an academic curiosity. It reflected a growing sense of English identity, a subtle but powerful reclaiming of cultural space from the Norman influence. Alongside the evolution of language, medieval England witnessed a blossoming of architectural innovation, particularly in its magnificent cathedrals and parish churches. From the sturdy, Romanesque forms of Durham Cathedral, with its massive pillars and rounded arches, to the soaring, ethereal grace of Gothic masterpieces like Salisbury and Westminster Abbey. These structures were more than just places of worship. They were encyclopedias in stone, embodying theological beliefs, artistic aspirations, and technological prowess. The development of the pointed arch, the ribbed vault, and the flying buttress allowed for taller walls, larger windows, and a breathtaking sense of light and space. Stained glass, depicting biblical stories and saints' lives, bathed the interiors in jewel-toned light, educating an largely illiterate populace and inspiring awe. Each generation of builders added its own layer, creating a rich architectural palimpsest that still speaks of centuries of devotion and craftsmanship. The sheer scale and complexity of these projects required immense organization, skilled labor, and significant financial resources, often taking generations to complete. The masons, carpenters, glaziers, and sculptors who contributed to these wonders were highly skilled artisans, their names often lost to time, but their collective genius remains evident in the enduring beauty of their creations. The social structures of medieval England, though seemingly rigid, also underwent significant, albeit gradual changes. The feudal system, with its hierarchical arrangement of lords, knights, and peasants, dominated much of the period. Land was the basis of wealth and power, and society was broadly divided into those who prayed, the clergy, those who fought, the nobility, and those who worked, the commoners. However, the growth of towns and cities, fueled by trade and nascent industries, began to introduce new social mobility. Merchants, artisans, and skilled laborers formed guilds, which protected their members, regulated trade, and provided a sense of community and mutual support. These urban centers, though still relatively small by modern standards, offered alternatives to the agricultural life of the manor, attracting people seeking new opportunities. The Black Death in the mid-14th century had a profound and disruptive impact on these social structures. By drastically reducing the population, it created a labor shortage, empowering surviving peasants to demand better wages and conditions. This shift, though initially resisted by the landowning class, ultimately contributed to the slow erosion of serfdom and the rise of a more independent peasantry. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, while brutally suppressed, was a stark manifestation of these underlying social tensions and the growing assertiveness of the common people. Education, primarily under the purview of the Church, also saw significant developments. Monasteries had long been centers of learning. Preserving ancient texts and producing illuminated manuscripts. However, the 12th and 13th centuries witnessed the establishment of universities at Oxford and Cambridge, institutions that would become cornerstones of intellectual life. These universities initially focused on theology, law, and medicine, attracted scholars and students from across Europe, fostering a vibrant intellectual environment. The scholastic method, emphasizing logic, debate, and the reconciliation of faith and reason, dominated academic discourse. Though access was limited primarily to men from wealthier backgrounds, these universities played a crucial role in shaping the intellectual landscape, producing educated administrators for the church and state, and contributing to the broader European intellectual currents. The very act of establishing institutions dedicated to higher learning, separate from monastic control, marked a significant step towards a more formalized and accessible system of education, even if its reach was still narrow. Beyond these grand narratives, the medieval period left a rich tapestry of cultural practices and beliefs that permeated daily life. Folk traditions, often intertwined with Christian observances, shaped seasonal festivals and community gatherings. Storytelling, whether through epic poems like Beowulf in the earlier period or the chivalric romances of the later Middle Ages, provided entertainment and moral instruction. Music, from plainsong chants in cathedrals to secular ballads sung in taverns, was an integral part of life. The visual arts, beyond architecture, flourished in illuminated manuscripts, intricate carvings, and vibrant wall paintings, often serving didactic purposes in a largely illiterate society. These artistic expressions, though often anonymous, reflect a deep aesthetic sensibility and a profound engagement with spiritual and worldly concerns. One lesser-known detail about medieval English life is the widespread use of memento mori imagery. These artistic and symbolic reminders of mortality, such as skulls, skeletons, or decaying corpses, were not meant to be morbid in a modern sense, but rather to encourage reflection on the fleeting nature of earthly life and the importance of preparing for the afterlife. They appeared in churches, on tombs, and even in personal devotional objects, serving as a constant, gentle nudge towards spiritual contemplation. This pervasive cultural motif speaks to a worldview deeply shaped by Christian theology and the ever-present reality of death in an age without modern medicine. Historians still debate the precise extent to which medieval England can be considered a nation in the modern sense. While the Norman conquest had imposed a unified monarchy and a centralized administration, regional identities remained strong, and the concept of a shared Englishness was still evolving. Was it primarily a linguistic identity, forged in the crucible of Middle English? Was it a political identity, defined by allegiance to the king and participation in institutions like Parliament? Or was it a cultural identity, expressed through shared customs, laws, and religious practices? The answer likely lies in a complex interplay of all these factors, gradually coalescing over centuries. The 100 Years' War, paradoxically, played a significant role in this process, fostering a sense of common purpose against a foreign adversary, and strengthening the use of English as a national language. The legal system, too, saw fundamental developments. Common law, based on custom and judicial precedent, rather than codified statutes, began to take shape during the reign of Henry II, 1154 to 1189. This system, which evolved through the decisions of royal courts, created a relatively uniform body of law across the kingdom, replacing the disparate local customs that had prevailed earlier. The establishment of juries, initially as bodies of local witnesses and later as impartial arbiters of fact, was another crucial innovation. These legal reforms laid the foundation for the English legal system that would eventually spread throughout the common law world, a testament to the enduring influence of medieval legal thought. The concept of due process, however nascent, and the gradual assertion of individual rights against arbitrary power can trace their origins to these medieval legal innovations. The agricultural landscape itself was transformed. The open field system, where villagers cultivated strips of land within large common fields, was a dominant feature of medieval farming. This communal approach to agriculture, while seemingly inefficient to modern eyes, ensured a degree of fairness and cooperation within the village community. The introduction of new farming techniques, such as the heavy plough and the three-field rotation system, gradually increased agricultural productivity, supporting a growing population and contributing to the economic vitality of the kingdom. These innovations, though slow to spread, represented a continuous, practical engagement with the land that sustained the vast majority of the population. Even the very landscape of England bears the marks of this era. The network of roads, though often poorly maintained, connected towns and villages. Bridges, some of which still stand today, facilitated travel and trade. The remnants of castles, whether grand fortresses or humble motte and bailey structures, dot the countryside, silent sentinels of a turbulent past. The layout of many English towns, with their market squares, parish churches, and winding streets, reflects their medieval origins. These physical legacies are not merely relics. They are tangible connections to a world long past, offering glimpses into the lives and aspirations of the people who shaped them. The medieval period in England, therefore, was far more than a mere prelude to the modern age. It was a time of profound cultural fermentation, where disparate elements, Anglo-Saxon traditions, Norman innovations, and European influences mingled and fused to create something uniquely English. From the nuanced cadences of Middle English to the soaring arches of Gothic cathedrals, from the intricate workings of common law to the evolving dynamics of social life, the foundations of a nation were meticulously laid. The echoes of these centuries, subtle yet persistent, continue to resonate through the language we speak, the institutions we inherit, and the landscapes we inhabit, a testament to the enduring legacy of a transformative era.